it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce to the stage our guests. Panelists, come and join me. Coming to the stage. Everybody comfortable. Thank you, panel. Let me introduce you to who these lovely people are. We've got Charles Hecker. Charles has spent 40 years traveling and working in the Soviet Union and Russia. He's worked as a journalist and a geopolitical risk consultant, and he's got a new book out. It's called Zero Sum: Adventures in Russian Capitalism, and it's out now, isn't it, Charles?
Yes, it is. Thank you very much, Emma.
There you go. We'll go and buy it. Gorana Grgić is, well, Dr. Gorana Grgić is senior researcher with the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic security team at ETH's Zurich Center for Security Studies. Her research interests include US and EU foreign policy, transatlantic relations, and conflict resolution. She's a regular contributor on radio and television and is Monocle magazine security correspondent. Welcome, Gorana. Ruben van Hofwegen is a seconded national expert from NCSCNL to ENISA, the EU cybersecurity agency. Previously, he's been working in several functions in the area of national security. Ieva Ilves brings more than 20 years of public policy expertise. She specializes in foreign affairs, security, digital transformation, and cybersecurity. Her government service includes roles as head of Latvia's national cybersecurity policy. She advises Ukraine's Ministry of Digital Transformation and WithSecure, and she's a former First Lady of Estonia as well. And Marta Lorimer is a lecturer in politics at Cardiff University. His research interests include far-right policies with specialism on the far right in France and Italy. Can we have a round of applause for our wonderful panel before we start? Now, just to let you into another little secret, we usually have a bit of a conversation before we start doing this panel. So there is a bit of preparation. I remember when we had this conversation a few weeks ago, Ieva, you sort of came off by saying, we live in a time of war. Which war or wars are we talking about?
Yes, unfortunately, we do live in times of war, and actually many wars. And we can call them different names, but there are conflicts, and there is a war in our neighborhood in Europe, Russia's invasion in Ukraine. There is a war in Gaza and in Middle East. There are conflict situations brewing around the globe. But what I was meaning in the context of today's discussion is that these are physical wars that we can see, but digital war actually is that invisible part that touches all of us. Because these physical wars, we tend to look at those news headlines and we associate them with certain geographical areas, and no matter how far or close they are not our house. But digital is actually our house, and that is that invisible part that is taking place, that has no geographical limits, and that is happening right now, right here, also in all of our countries.
And Marta, just looking at the fact that, Ieva's talking about conflict, but when you have conflict, that assumes that the rules-based order that we kind of got very comfortable with doesn't seem to be there anymore. I mean, has what's happened sort of like ruined it for everybody who believes that there was a rules-based order that we could all rely upon?
Yes, I think that for several decades now, we got into a situation where we thought that we all agreed on how the world works. We agreed that there are certain rules about certain things, such as trade, for example, such as you don't go and invade your neighboring country. Or at least we did believe this in the European Union, and there was a general idea that the world was working in a way that enabled many of us to flourish. And I think the last few years have really shown us that what we had taken for granted for several years is simply no longer true. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was really putting a dent into this idea that, we are in a situation of peace and that trade will generate peace. The arrival of Donald Trump at the presidency of the United States and his decision to start a trade war, again, went against much of the narrative that if we keep trade going, we are all going to be better off. And the question is, how do we adapt to this new situation where what we thought we knew is no longer true, and we have to find out what is replacing it, because right now we are in between probably two different worlds, and we don't really know what is coming next.
And Charles, to bring you in now, because of your work with businesses in Russia over the last few years, or until not too long ago, the idea that the collapse of the rules-based order, what effect does that have on business and the way that businesses have been operating in the last few years?
Yeah, so this period of disruption that Marta just described, this sort of departure from our comfort zone, and even the allusions that Antti made to this in his opening remarks, showing a picture of the Berlin Wall and talking about European values. This period of disruption is one of the things that companies are struggling with more than anything else. And what we're trying to determine is whether this disrupted comfort zone that Marta described is a temporary sense on the way to some sort of new rules-based order. And, is it a sort of sphere of influence world where you have the US in charge of half the world and China in charge of the other half of the world? I think that sort of picture is unlikely because it leaves Europe out of the picture, for example. But what we know is that, we used to have most of the world up to 100 years ago run by Britain. Then we had the Pax Americana. And now we're not quite sure what we have. And I think the most important question to ask is do we feel this instability because we're on our way to a new status quo? Or do we feel this instability now because this is the status quo? That this instability in geopolitics, in business, in cyber, in every aspect of our life, that this may be where we are and where we're going to be, and that's what companies are going to have to get used to instead of hoping that this all passes after another couple of years.
And Gorana, you were nodding furiously when Charles was saying, we don't know where we're going, do we? And that's incredibly destabilizing from the point of view of industry and business.
Sure. It's a boring panel if all of your panelists are in vehement agreement with one another, but I think I would underscore this point that Charles made about where we are at the moment and where it is that we are going, because there is such a thing as a peril of presentism, right? That we think it's never been as bad, right? That basically we are now in such uncharted waters, but then a lot of people would say, look, like in terms of various indicators of development, we actually have it quite good. I would push back on that because precisely of the reasons that Charles and Marta made, that there is a sense that a lot of the rules according to which both states and businesses were operating for quite some time are being torn apart, and are being torn apart by the very country that was underwriting so much of the system that they played by all of these rules, principles, even some of the norms, right? Things that are unwritten. And then the question is this going to be some sort of interregnum period after which there is a new steady state? And here, just to Charles's point, I would say that there are different futures that we can imagine where it could be spheres of influence and this sort of concert of powers like arrangements where basically major or great powers set the rules, right? And they say this is what will happen in our different spheres. This is the concept of polycentricity as well, which is propagated, for instance, by the likes of China and similar. Or is it going to be some sort of world where it is truly a jungle and we don't have so many rules? And then it's up to the countries that have to take those rules to kind of make sense of that. And again, coming back to the opening keynote, I would say, we as Europeans then really need to think hard what it is that we mean by European values, right? And how do we actually shape that future, right? Is it together with other, hopefully liberal democracies, which are far and few in between these days, right? Or is it with the like-minded countries? Are we willing to partner with countries with whose regimes we are not maybe as comfortable with, but that are also willing to come up with a new set of rules because they don't want to live in a world where might is right?
Thank you for that, Gorana. I mean, just the picture that we've painted at the moment, obviously, with this idea that walls are being built up, walls are being break down. Ruben, I want to bring you in with your cybersecurity hat on. Does this mean that anybody can be a target?
Well, I think if you look, for example, and I think it was also mentioning in the opening keynote, if you look at all the elections that are held well, for so to say, at least the last couple of years, no matter how big or small these elections were, it was a target. Everybody represents and has a value. Thus, it is a target to influence, to attack these elections. So, and I think in a broader perspective, from a cybersecurity point of view, we all know that everything can be a target, everything can be an entrance, and we are strong. Okay, it's a little bit of an open door there, but we are strong as our weakest link, and I think it shows quite well lately.
How much have you seen, I'll say with you, Ruben, how much have you seen in the last few years the way that things, governments, organisations are targeted? I mean, you mentioned the influence of online campaigning. I mean, let's just see what happened in Romania. They had to rerun the presidential election at the weekend. And you suddenly think, actually, cybersecurity is only one facet of a bigger thing where actually open source stuff is actually quite dangerous too, quite complicated.
Yeah, well, looking indeed from only the cybersecurity point of view, but I think indeed it's on many facets of all of this, and and a little bit coming back to what was said earlier, I think you were saying it like it is war, and it's especially on the cybersecurity. There was this interesting book already years ago that says it is war, but nobody sees it. I really recommend you that if you really want to learn a little bit more about the geopolitics into cyberspace and where the geopolitics enters this cyberspace. So yeah, I think you can say that.
And Ieva, in your experience, when you're doing Latvia's national security, cybersecurity policy and what have you, you're doing it from the point of view of a government trying to stop bad stuff from happening, as simple as that. I mean, what is that like day to day? Are you able to think strategically, or do you have to just drink from the fire hose of stuff that's coming down at you?
At least from Latvia's experience, I think we were able and we are able to think strategically. We are bordering the country which is aggressive, and we historically know that. So we are always prepared in all the domains, including digital. So we would think strategically. I found the biggest challenge that because of innovation and technology on the internet, of all the great things, and now all the great AI opportunities, the world is very decentralized from the perspective of government, and very vulnerable in such a way. And so I need a private sector be on the same level of security as my hardcore, critical infrastructure, because some of them are some third-party providers, some of them are linked in some other ways. So that's a very difficult, the most difficult part is to get some of those, your clients or services who are here in the audience, right, to be on the same level of security, because they face disproportionate force. They can be attacked by the state-level threat actor, while they'll defend as a small or medium enterprise. And that's where you have this horrifying disbalance. And from government perspective, it's very difficult to keep sort of market rules, not to intrude, not to over-regulate, yet get the private sector to the same level to keep your whole societal resilience.
Just to let you know that we have people wandering around with microphones, and we will do in a little while. So if you do have any questions, please do raise your hand. It's kind of hard to see up here because there's some bright lights, but we will be opening the floor up in a little while to any questions that you might have for the panelists. I think you can do a bit of a surgery for everybody. And also, there will be prizes for the best question tomorrow. So I need a little bit of competitive spirit among you guys this afternoon, simply because it may be worth a treat. We don't know what it is. Could be good. Just let's move on a little bit to what actually, let's drill down a little bit more with you, Ieva, the fact that you were talking about what you were doing in Latvia. But Ukraine is a very hot and present problem. What are you seeing in Ukraine in terms of the attacks on companies and the private sector, as well as on the government? And what are you telling them? How are you helping?
Mm-hmm. So, first of all, I want to thank their colleagues. Actually, we brought 5 people from Ukraine. So really take opportunity, talk to people from Ukraine. Those are the real defenders, and I huge respect for you guys for what you do and for being here.
Thank you for coming.
And they probably are able to give you more sort of in-depth answers. But what I see is that attacks are huge, constant, non-stoppable. And one part is to be able to defend, to be able to see. And the other super important part that I admire Ukrainians for are to recover quickly. You know, you basically live with assumption that you will be attacked, and you might be compromised, or you might be interfered. And you build all these different ways how to recover and keep moving on, and how to protect and eliminate or isolate. And what I do, my biggest part of the work is actually to raise this topic globally and encourage companies like WithSecure, other European partners and global partners to support Ukraine, to invest in Ukraine's cybersecurity, because again, we all tend to see war very physical, and that's, of course, is very dramatic to see people dying. I have to say that what we learned from Ukraine, a lot of that is digital, a lot of that is cybersecurity in those deaths. It's capabilities to see, predict, analyze, and target very precisely civilian objects. So I think my job is really to help to advocate and raise this so-called invisible war, invisible part, because to protect yourself digitally is also expensive. But that's also a win-win for everyone who works with Ukraine, because you basically learn to defend yourself the best. So I really hope that part of European sovereignty, what we talked with Antti and with the company here, is actually go massively helping Ukraine in order for Europeans to be better protected, learning from Ukraine's experience.
And Gorana, just listening to that, you know, Ieva talks about this, you have to accept that you're going to be attacked all the time, and that's a preparedness which is acute, real, never-ending. But are there still temptations by lots of companies to react in a way of saying, look, it's not affecting me now, but if I ignore it for long enough, it'll go away? I mean, some of us are just going, oh, I don't know what's coming next. I mean, there's that idea that can you ignore it? I mean, if you're in Ukraine, you certainly can't. But is there a sense that some companies do just not deal with it for monetary reasons, for whatever reason?
Well, I would say that, of course, there would be a temptation if the threat is not immediate or you don't sense necessarily that kind of same environment, that you might think you're safe for now, right? But I think that in terms of the way, I can't necessarily speak for corporations, I can speak more for state actors, right? That there is a lot more of a realization that we are now in a paradigm where it's all about resilience, right? Building that resilience, being prepared for what might come next. We are no longer, you know, if you want to use the kind of business language, right, we have gone past the sort of just-in-time model, right, into just-in-case, right, that you need to build some sort of slack, right? You need to be prepared. So from that perspective, I think that there is a lot more talk, which hopefully then spurs some sort of action. But I would say also, in terms of the lessons from Ukraine these days, it is, and I don't like talking about, you know, any kind of war that's going on as a kind of laboratory of anything for us to study, right? Because there are real lives of people who are affected on a daily basis, as you would know. So just to kind of caveat that, but I think in terms of everything that is coming from Ukraine these days shows us just the way that the nature of warfare has evolved, but also the way that it has stayed the same, right? Where at the same time we have the kind of World War I trench-style warfare, which tells us mass is important, right? Ammunition is important. We need to have defense industrial base ready to respond to this challenge in a way that we necessarily haven't seen from Europeans in particular, but also to an extent from Americans, because there is just such a huge demand for simply munitions, right? But then on the other hand, the other part of this evolution of warfare, where we see the blurring of front lines, or basically this idea that there are no more front lines at all, right? That companies play an integral role in the security of a particular country. And very brief two examples, right? One coming just on the eve of Russia's full-scale invasion, where Microsoft was actually picking up these signals, and I can see some of the nodding heads right here, right, that there were so many of these attacks now in the digital sphere, right, which were telling something that something is going on, right? And the way that companies then can provide, for instance, resources such as digital embassies for countries basically that are facing attack to protect some of their most vulnerable data, for instance, right? Or the more infamous example, which came out from the reporting about Starlink's sort of operations around Ukraine, right? And the way that a single company can be crucial in the way that you can command and control operations on the field simply by switching on and off satellite reception. So from that perspective, this is a whole new game, right? One where companies are increasingly being integrated in the kind of command and control chain.
Ruben, if you can add a little bit to that. I mean, when you are seeing within your work that crossing over of private and public, I mean, I think the example that we can come up with quite easily is attacks on power cables going down to Estonia. They are fundamental to the social, economic functioning of a nation. It's private companies that run an awful lot of the parts of it, yet it was a state actor that took the power out.
Well, I think we fully realize that I think 85% of our critical infrastructure is in the hands of private partners. So we can simply not ignore that fact, so we are dependent on them. How we cooperate with each other, that is the point where we really should focus on. If I stay at the Ukraine war at this moment, I think it was last year or the year before, there was the Kyivstar, the telecom provider that was hacked and it was completely down. Within a couple of days, they restored it. This is something that we really can learn. I don't know how it will be if I take it to my own country, the Netherlands. I think there will be a lot of discussions and a lot of meetings how we can solve this problem. They solved it immediately. That is something that we can learn from that.
We need to get one of you guys up here so you can tell us how it is. If you can find another chair and someone wants to hop on, we'd be delighted to. Let's think a little bit about a couple of people on the panel have mentioned the idea of values. And we are in an unconference where European values are very much being, the center stage and possibly the world forward. I mean, Marta, are values and indeed the European values, I mean, what are the European values?
God, if I had an answer to this question, I wouldn't be sitting here.
Maybe it's because you do and you are.
I think that this is part of the problem that the European Union is dealing with right now is that it has its values in theory. It has a series of principles that it explicitly says that it espouses. It espouses the idea of peace. It espouses a liberal democratic system of government. It respects human rights and it believes that that is its USP. What its real problem is that those values are being challenged by the world outside because it's very difficult to operate in that way in a world that is in an increasing state of conflict. And more problematically, those values are being challenged from the inside. There are some member states that are quite clearly violating some of these principles. I will say no names, however, Hungary is the case in point here. And it's becoming increasingly clear that there are other countries that might follow suit, particularly by voting increasingly for parties, such as far-right parties, that do not necessarily buy into those values. And the question is, how do you keep protecting those values and avoid being captured by the kind of authors that don't respect them? Because this is what we're seeing, is that the European Union, in spite of the fact that it still holds on to these values nominally, is backsliding on some of them. And it's not just Hungary, it's the EU as a whole that has a problem now.
And that, Charles, makes it very difficult when it comes to people deciding where to go, who to choose, what, and how the whole thing works, given the fact that if the European Union is struggling internally with values, how does that project it to the outside world and whether it can be a reliable partner?
Well, on the subject of reliable partners, I thought I might take advantage of my American accent and elaborate on that point, because I think that when you hear a company CEO talk about basing a company and basing a product and a service on European values, what he's saying there, to my ears, and I don't want to put words in Anti's mouth, but what you hear is that we used to normally very comfortably say things like Western values or transatlantic values. And I think, saying European values, whoever says it, is placing a new emphasis on the fact that there may no longer be transatlantic values, or the concept of Western values is now perhaps split in two, and that there are European values in the West, and there are, on the other side of the Atlantic, quite a serious shakeup right now of what American values are. This sort of America first, and our enemies are our friends, and our friends are our enemies, and this sense of America having suffered for making the world a safer place and building the system that Gorana referred to in her remarks. I think what's interesting is that we were concerned that there would be an external attack on our values, and that certainly is happening, as Marta's mentioned. But I think some of the greatest damage to this transatlantic fortress that we had is genuinely coming from within and coming from the other side of the Atlantic. And, that process isn't finished. And the other thing is, just to close on not such an encouraging point, forgive me for that, but once you take something apart, like trust, reliability, values, and alliances, that's really, really hard to put back together.
Ieva, when you're doing your day-to-day, how much do values get mentioned in the heat of the day?
Quite a lot. And I worked in my previous capacity also advisor to Latvian president in times when Europe was drafting Digital Service Act and Digital Market Act, and there was a lot of value and freedom discussion. And my takeaway, and again, I'm one of those democratic countries, beneficiary and enjoy all the freedoms and value, but I have a feeling that we have placed that much emphasis on freedoms, on values, on our rights, and we somehow have forgotten responsibility and accountability. And I think somewhere we have to renegotiate the social contract in terms of how we design digital societies, because we clearly don't want to be surveilled societies like China does it, but we need certain contract how we can exchange data, how we can be efficient, how we can be held accountable, how we can build the systems that respect the freedoms and values, but yet we work on them. They are workable, they are doable, they are compatible to others, and they can compete and be scaled. So I find this value and freedom discussions that I've seen, I think, nearly 15 years, that we kind of we lack implementation part, how to design and implement with accountability and responsibility, because freedoms and rights don't come without responsibilities. And that part doesn't get implemented. And I think that's also true for cybersecurity.
Who wants to take that on? I mean, let's talk to you, Ruben, about the difficulty of implementing values. And Ieva just meant cybersecurity. How do you go about using values as a tool to keep your cybersecurity in top notch and to sort of make sure that you're protected in a world where we don't know who's our enemy next week?
Well, I don't know if it's if it's made that explicit all the time. I think it's more implicit. Actually, in preparing this, I had to look up what the values of the EU were that were anchored in the Treaty of Lisbon. But jokes aside, I think if you look from a cybersecurity perspective, you really have to determine for yourself what is important for you and what is it worth and what kind of layers of protection you want to build around it. And there are a lot of values implied in these decisions that I think every organization has to make for themselves. But it would be very nice if they are aligned with our EU values.
Can you possibly drill in a bit more with an example? Because we have on the one hand that fact that freedom is incredibly precious. But also, as Ieva just went, responsibility is incredibly important as well. And when you're dealing with companies and organizations and countries, and you're trying to give them some advice or deal with whatever is coming your way, I mean, how do you begin to create a balance where both are satisfied?
I think, and also from the ENISA perspective, we work very closely with a number of private partners. We have a program for that. And what we there do is just start the conversation and start sharing what we see. Mm-hmm. And this conversation is not necessarily put in writing or black and white, etc., but keep this conversation. And there are also partners from within the EU and from outside the EU. And it's very interesting to see, because we meet every now and then, that for now I don't see a change. But it's also depending on what level you talk to, because this is most of the time on a more technical level. And there I see sometimes a little bit the old, the old dynamics that from the early days of cybersecurity, so to say, when things were shared between technicians without giving a hoot what is above them. And I think I like that, and it's still there, and I like to see, and I'm very relieved it's still there, but it's something that is very precious and that we have to keep working on.
Now, a quick show of hands. When you are discussing cybersecurity in your companies and organizations, how often do you actually go back to values? One person over there, what, two? And does it help you shape your decision process? We do have a microphone somewhere, but if you can go over the people who are upstairs. Stand up, sir, and introduce yourself. And I think there is someone with a microphone, I think coming there's someone who's going to run across the sand. So let's have an ambulance on standby. No, we're fine. Okay, well done. Introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit more about how this shapes you.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Peter. We help servicing our clients managing risks, and also within the jungle of cybersecurity. We start with the values of the company that we serve. So we go back to them. Why do you exist? What does your customer look like? And how can we defend your crown jewels? So we based on those core values from a customer perspective, and then provide value to them. So that's
can you give us an example of something that you've done when you've looked at a client's values and thought, okay, we're going to need to do this in terms of their cybersecurity?
Yes, one example for a mobility customer who are in transit of customer data, of geo data. So that's very valuable data if in the wrong hands. And what they aim for is they serve an elderly target audience. And they've built their company around it just for the sake of helping those people from a UI perspective.
Okay.
And based on that needs, make it really simple for the elderly, usable. Regulations or the hardening of the security, is then a challenge to pick a side. What do we choose? Go be fully on security or fully based on the user interface, for example. So choices has to be made, and then those values are being added from an extra layer in security.
Peter, thank you very much. Does anybody else have values being discussed when they're actually trying to plan their cyber security policy? Or indeed, are there other things which are more important that you just think, actually, the values can come later, we just need to build a very secure wall? Does anyone want to comment on that one? Because we can go back to the panel. I think one thing that we need to look at now is the future. When we have the unknown, right? Charles, how do we plan? Can we plan? There was a thing in the FT a couple of days ago saying everybody plans for the strategy, but no one plans for the scenario that isn't part of any of the strategy.
So this is another one of the biggest challenges arising out of this environment of uncertainty and disruption, and that is companies want to be able to plan. Companies are nothing more, really, than big organizations that like to make plans. And then maybe they sell things and they buy things and they do other things. But every company likes to plan 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years into the future. When I was in the consulting business, we had a company come up to us and say, can you please tell us what safe will look like 40 years from now? And I think that there's a shift in the way companies are trying to predict the future, or at least I should say there should be a shift in the way that companies predict the future. And most companies used to make forecasts, and they would concoct these views of the future that would say, okay, this is 60% likely, and this is 30% likely, and this is our outlier, 10% likely, it's never going to happen, don't worry about it. And the problem is that it's that 10% that has been happening over and over and over again in the past, I don't know, for decades now. I mean, the list of things that nobody predicted is really, really, really long, going, well, decades. If you think that nobody predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that was just the first mistake that we made out of a lot. The shift, I think, that's happening, and I think this is to companies' advantage, is that they're relying more on scenarios, and they're building possible visions or possible versions of the future that don't have to be right or wrong. That's the beauty of scenarios. They're just testing our assumptions, they're testing our business models, they're testing our key uncertainties. And when a company builds a scenario or multiple scenarios together, they have a common vocabulary of risk that I think, since somebody on the panel mentioned the word resilience, when something happens, if a scenario materializes, then you know what to do. And it doesn't matter whether it was a most likely scenario or an outlier scenario.
Thank you for that. We've got about 4 minutes left, so if anybody has a quick question, then raise your hand now. Otherwise, I will go straight to the panel and say, right, you have a group of people who need to take away one thing when they're in their pajamas tonight and they're thinking, I learned one thing from the panel. Marta, what would you like, or who wants to go first? Because I've just thrown you under the bus already. So who wants to go first? What's that one thing that you want everybody to think of tonight when they're done?
Shall I start?
Yes, go on.
Okay, quickly. I don't think we mentioned this. Well, we came very close to this in the panel, and the one thing I want everyone to think about tonight is that companies, now more than ever, are geopolitical actors. Yeah. And that will dictate the level of threat against you, the level of resilience that's required, and your positioning in the geopolitical world. There are private sector actors and public sector actors equally in the world now.
Thank you, Charles. Gorana, you're next door.
I'll go just with the phrase radical uncertainty. That was the name of the book that came out just basically a couple of weeks before the COVID pandemic struck, and that was already feeling like kind of apocalyptic world that we were living in. But I do think that it resonates well to today for the reasons I elaborated earlier. I think that there is this sort of sense that the kind of old world, right, has died and the new one is struggling to be born. And I don't want to be too Gramscian about it, but it is really this sense of fragmentation and fracturing that we as individuals, but then also companies and states find themselves in. And again, to just go back to the opening keynote, I think that idea of building systems, right, is an interesting one where as individuals, again, and as companies and as states, we do have agency still, even in the wake of that radical uncertainty, to put forward a sort of vision where maybe we can be a little bit hopeful about where we go next, even in the wake of all of these things kind of being shifting pieces around.
It's quite nice to hear the word hopeful being mentioned on this panel. Ruben, how about you?
Very quick, I think. Yes, what is not mentioned here is the way to digital sovereignty. And I really liked it because it's hard. We don't know exactly how to do it, how long it will take. But I liked what was mentioned at the opening keynote. Do it brick by brick. We have some initiatives also from our perspective. For example, there was a couple of weeks ago a lot of fuss about the MITRE who's working on the vulnerability database. We have now a European alternative. Do it brick by brick and set your priorities straight there.
Thank you for that. Ieva?
Well, I stick to the point with the conflicts, and I really want to, you who work in a business and might think that, thanks God, war is not at my place and geopolitics is somewhere high above, really go away with the thought that the conflict in digital is happening now, and there are no exceptions, and the easiest targets are attacking more. And if you don't see that you've been attacked, you probably don't see it, not that you are not attacked. And so really pay attention to that we do live in this conflict era. It doesn't matter whether you are big or small. The other side is already penetrating the systems, collecting the data, everything that potentially can be handy, whatever soft or hard power military has to be exploited. So I don't want to threaten people with war coming. I hope we are strong enough and resilient enough in Europe and with US to resist. Yet we have to put that emphasis that in digital domain, this conflict is ongoing, and it starts from everyone, and everybody needs to be focused on that.
Thank you for that. A final word to you, Marta Lorimer.
Well, since I'm the last one, I will leave with a word of hope, which is, I think it's echoing Gorana, right? We are in a world of uncertainty. The thing with risk is that you can sort of predict it, you can put a number on it. With uncertainty, you don't have that. The good thing about uncertainty is that it gives you an opportunity to think about where is it that we want to go next. And I think this should be really at the forefront of our thinking. If we are in this interregnum where we don't quite know, we know where we're coming from, we don't know where we're going, let's think about where it is that we're going and what we want that place to look like, because there is a chance when things are being moved that you can actually rebuild something positive from it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. We're going to have to leave it there because we have run out of time. We're going to have a little break now, but a warm thanks